Welcome back to our study of the Old Testament, looking at background materials as we go through this quarter. And this is our beginning of looking at the Old Testament from a chronological perspective. So tonight we will be looking at the age of the patriarchs. Then next week, the Exodus, the Conquest, and the Judges. After that, David and the United Kingdom. So Saul, David, and Solomon, basically. And then we'll look at the divided kingdom and then Judah alone and the exile as we go through from a chronological standpoint. And we will try to match up prophets with kings and things like that as best we can in the short period of time that we have. And then in the month of February, we'll look at the different peoples of the Bible, the peoples from Mesopotamia first, and then those across the Jordan, but not as far as Mesopotamia. And then we'll look at Anatolia and Syria-Palestine. Then finally, we'll look at the Egyptians, since they play such a role in many places throughout the Old Testament. So that is our continued plan. And today we'll be looking at the patriarchs. Before we jump into our New Testament passage, I do want to give credit for a lot of the pictures you'll see, some of the illustrations. They come from the Archaeological Study Bible. This is the NIV Archaeological Study Bible. It's fabulous. The notes and the articles and the various things in here are really, really good. And I recommend it. ESV has an Archaeological Study Bible as well. And all these tools are definitely worth looking into. And I think even with the teeny bit of exposure you'll get to it in this lesson, you might be encouraged to go buy it. It's really a great tool. Well, our New Testament passage talks about the patriarchs. Jesus references them in this passage. So Matthew 22, verses 23 to 33. This is at a point in Jesus' ministry where he is being tested pretty consistently by the Sadducees, Pharisees, others. The same day, Sadducees came to him, who say that there is no resurrection, and they asked him a question, saying, Teacher, Moses said, if a man dies having no children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died, and having no offspring, left his wife to his brother. So too the second and third, down to the 7th. After them all, the woman died. In the resurrection, therefore, of the 7, whose wife will she be? For they all had her. Well, Jesus, of course, knows they don't even believe in the resurrection. They don't even believe there's an afterlife, the Sadducees. And so, totally a setup. And he points that out pretty much immediately in his answer. But Jesus answered them, You are wrong, because you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God. They just don't even have the right basis. They don't have the right foundation at all. And then he does answer them. For in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And we would add in that sense, as far as not being married. And as for the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was said to you by God? I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not God of the dead, but of the living. And when the crowd heard it, they were astonished at his teaching. And I always love these little statements about the astonishment, the amazement of the crowd. Of course, the Sadducees were not happy with this, but the crowd was amazed. The crowd loved it. And over again, we read that Jesus taught with authority, that he had a way with explaining the scriptures. And of course, he is and was at that point as well the Son of God. And so, but his ability to relate, his ability to teach is a great example for us. All right, well, notice that he does mention Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that is the time of the patriarchs that we'll be looking at today. Actually, we'll basically be looking at the book of Genesis today, and then we'll move into the Exodus, etc., next week. So let's look at a timeline, and I'm going to put this is one of the most basic timelines, that's for sure. Um, not very detailed at all, but these are the things that kind of helped me. I always thought about Abraham being around the year 2000. Really, it would be better to say Jacob was born right around the year 2000 BC. But I always thought about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob around 2000, David around 1000, which he did reign from 1010 to 970 BC. So that's pretty accurate. And then just these basic dates, the Exodus at 1446, so around 1500, Moses. Um, and of course, they wandered around for 40 years. So Moses' death is 1406, 40 years after the Exodus from Egypt. And this is one of the first times I've really noticed all this, but notice that Jacob was born in 2006 BC, right where that yellow line is, right near that 2000 marker. And a lot of people feel Jesus was born in 6 BC, that we kind of, the calendar's not quite right, somewhere between 4 and 6 BC. So the nation of the namesake for the nation of Israel was born at 2000 years before Christ, if 6 BC is Jesus' birth. And of course, Jacob's name was changed to Israel. So physical Israel born, so to speak, 2000 years before spiritual Israel uh, through Jesus Christ. So just kind of a cool thing. And David reigning really 1,000 years almost exactly before Jesus' lifespan. Jesus probably did not live 40 years, but David was in office as king for that length of time from 1010 to 970 BC. Of course, the fall of Israel was at 722, the fall of Jerusalem, 586 BC. And then, of course, before even the year 500, the Jews were coming back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, rebuild the walls. They were promised 70 years in captivity. Of course, they went over in waves to the captivity in Babylon, and then came back in waves as well. The box showing David's reign, that's probably a little too wide for this scale. So, but um, crosses over the year 1000. All right, so just a basic general feel for the history. Now, the flood happened right around 2500 BC, 2350, 2450, so a little bit after the 2500 line. And then the Tower of Babel would have been within 100 years, but before Abram was born. So somewhere between 2350 and 2200 would have been the Tower of Babel. And so just to give you a little more perspective. So from 4000 to 2500, we have all that time leading up to the flood. And it was obviously a messy time, the but the earth was being populated, etc. And then, of course, in the flood, it gets wiped out. So, kind of a restart probably around 2350 BC is when the flood took place. All right. So let's look at the time of the patriarchs, and particularly Abram's path to the promised land. And I want us to notice a few things on here and some of these cities that we see on the map. We noticed a map last week or the week before where another possibility for was way farther north, maybe near Asher or Mari, not as far up as Haran because that's where, or Haran because that's where God commanded him to go. But of the Chaldeans, that's not a bad thought. Southern Babylonian territory, southern Mesopotamia would be probably pretty likely where that is showing that. But we're going to look at a little article that shows that Abram's father, grandfather, great grandfather, hit some of his ancestors. There are towns still up in Padan Aram that bear that name to this day. So pretty cool. So good evidence for biblical things, of course, and we appreciate those whenever we have them. Um, let's just take a moment to look at Abram's path. He was called by God to go to Haran. There in Padan Aram, and we're going to read an article that's maybe that is Haran, or the region around it, which this map obviously shows Padan Aram as a region, and then Haran, one of the cities in there. You'll notice that he would have gone through ancient Babylon, through Mari, and then not through Carchemish, but that's a notable city in world history. You notice Nineveh off there to the east, north of Asher and Nuzi. And then Abram heads to the promised land. And from Haran down to Shechem, that probably would have taken about a month. They figure with as many people as he had built up in Haran, the way his family slash little moving city had grown, probably the max they could go would be about 20 miles a day. And so if that's how long if that's how many miles they could get in a day, it would have taken about a month to get from Haran down to Shechem. All right, let's read a little article on Padan Aram, and this is from that NIV Archaeological Study Bible. The geographical name of Padan Aram has been found only in Genesis, and its meaning and exact location are uncertain. Many scholars believe that Padan Aram is an alternate name for Aram Naharaim, Aram of the two rivers, the northern region of the Euphrates River, in the vicinity of Haran, which figures prominently in Genesis as the patriarchs' ancestral home. The prophet Hosea referred to Jacob's journey to the country or field of Aram. Some scholars believe this phrase to be Hosea's translation of Padan Aram, based on the facts that a Ugaritic text refers to fields of Aram, and that it is Arabic that an Arabic noun Padan sometimes means field. This argument remains, however, inconclusive. Others suggest that Padan means road, based on the similar Akkadian word Padanu, highway. Thus, Padan Aram would mean road of Aram. A synonym of Padanu is the word Haranu, which may have been the source of Haran, the city from which Abram departed for Canaan. Understood in this light, Padan Aram would in fact be an alternate name for Haran. Although uncertainty about the name remains, scholars are confident that Padan Aram refers either to the region around Haran or to Haran itself. And so that makes a lot of sense. And there are some other words mentioned in this article. So I'm going to go back a slide back to the map. Notice Ugarit, Ugaritic was mentioned, the language. Ugarit is right there on the Mediterranean Sea, the farthest north city, as you're looking at the map, on the Mediterranean, and obviously pretty close to Padan Aram, relatively. Um, and it makes sense that they would have had a word for that. Another language that was mentioned in the article is Akkadian, and Akkad would have been in the Mesopotamian area. I'm not sure now, I forget, but I think pretty much halfway between Mari and Babylon, but right in the Mesopotamian area. All right, so let's look at Genesis 12, 1 through 9. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And of course, we have a messianic prophecy here. It's through his people, his line, that of course Christ comes, and that's how God blesses all the families of the earth through Abram. And then even beyond that, we have the idea of physical, that this lineage would lead to, of course, Jacob. We have Abram, then Isaac, then Jacob. Jacob's name is changed to Israel. So we have physical Israel directly coming from Abraham and Isaac, and of course, Jacob. And so we then have in the New Testament the fulfilling of all the old, and of course Christ being the head of the church, which is spiritual Israel, God's people, from not a physical standpoint, not a racial standpoint or a cultural standpoint, but a spiritual standpoint. All the children of God now receiving the Holy Spirit when they are baptized into Christ, and therefore having the word written on their hearts instead of on stone, a reference to the change from the old covenant to the new. So, really neat things as we read the blessing to Abram. And continuing on, verse 4. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built there an altar to the Lord, who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on, still going toward the Negev. The Negev just meaning deserted place, really could kind of just referring to the southern part of what when we look at a map, we think of Israel, the southern part, the more desert, the more arid area of Israel. All right, so let's go back to our timeline, and this time we have added to it the different peoples of Mesopotamia. And we'll look at some of these in detail when we get to the month of February. But it's worth just noting this. So as we lead up to the time of Abram born there with that light blue line, 2166, leading up to that, we have the early dynastic period, so just probably city-states, different rulers through there, different dynasties leading up to that time, and then the Akkadians. And so when Abram was born, it was either the time of the Akkadians or the time of the Sumerians. And in either case, we don't have a fine line as to exactly when that transition took place. But these are two of the earliest languages that we have, the Akkadian language and the Sumerian language, along with Hebrew, are some of the oldest that we have. There was a time when they did not feel Moses, secular scholars did not feel Moses could have written the 5 books of Moses, that he could not have written the books ascribed to him, because there was no way that the Hebrews had a written language yet. But that has been proven false. They have found different things that show that yes, they were probably literate in the time of Moses, and we would know that Moses would have had all the teaching of the Egyptians, and it was kind of a little bit silly for them not to think that Moses would have been literate. But probably the greater thought is that the Hebrew language was not yet in written form, but it sure seems like it. Well, it has been disproven. Moses definitely could have written the 5 books that bear his name. Once we get to Joseph, once we get to him passing, as you can see there in 1806 BC, approximately, we enter into an old Babylonian period in Mesopotamia. Again, this is in Mesopotamia. And then really from 1500 to 1000, it's not very well defined, but around 1000 BC, the Assyrian Empire comes into power. And of course, they're the ones that take the northern kingdom away. And then the Babylonian Empire, very short-lived, just really a blip on the historical screen, except for the fact that they were the ones that destroyed or finally got the southern kingdom into captivity. So they dragged them off into Babylonian captivity. And then the Persians take over. And then, of course, the Romans, it's the Roman Empire by the time we get to Jesus Christ. So this is another thing to help us understand the different periods of the Old Testament. And again, this is just Mesopotamia. Things are happening in Egypt, things are happening to the north as far as the Hittites and others. So, but concerning Mesopotamia, these are the different cultures, the different languages, the different peoples that were in charge during the Old Testament stretch from Abram all the way to Christ. All right, and here's the little article on Abram's ancestors, and I think this is really another neat article for us. According to the Old Testament, the patriarch's original homeland was in south central Turkey in an area known as Aram Naharaim or Padan Aram. Among the genealogical names of individuals listed in Genesis 11, three, Serug, Nahor, and Terah, have survived from antiquity also as names of towns in this region. The names of these biblical characters have been preserved in the very area from which the Bible specifies the patriarchs to have originated. Serug, Abram's great-grandfather, fathered Nahor at age 30 and died at age 230. His name, which corresponds to the place called Sargi in Assyrian inscriptions of the 7th century BC, lives on as modern Surik, 35 miles northwest of Haran. Nahor, Abram's grandfather, fathered Terah at age 29 and died at age 148. A town called Nahor is mentioned in Genesis 24:10 as the home of the descendants of Bethuel, another son of Nahor. This particular town also is mentioned in texts from Mari and Cappadocia from the 19th through the 18th centuries BC, as well as in Assyrian inscriptions from the 14th century BC. Later Assyrian records from the 7th century BC refer to it as Til Nakiri, which means mound of Nahor. Although Nahor's exact location is unknown today, numerous references in ancient texts place it in the Balik River Valley south of Haran. Terah fathered Abram at age 70 and died at age 205. A town named Til Terhari, Mound of Terah, is mentioned in 9th century BC Assyrian texts as being north of Haran, also on the Balik River. So pretty cool stuff that we have from other cultures that provide support and help in finding different things that are in the Bible. All right, so again, our timeline. This time I want us to focus in a little bit on Jacob, who of course becomes Israel. And this is where Jacob's name is changed to Israel. So I think this is worth our noting. Again, Jacob born almost exactly 2,000 years before Christ was born. Genesis 32. The same night he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford at Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. And Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day has broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men, and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered." The sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh. And so this is the first place that we have record of Jacob's name being changed to Israel, the first time that God does this. And of course, it is going to be confirmed in Genesis 35. And throughout the Old Testament, you might read in the prophets that the sons of Jacob or the tribes of Israel, and those might be interchanged. And so when you're reading Jacob said to Esau, you might be reading that, and the context is 1,000 years after Jacob and Esau died, or not 1,000, but anyway, a long period of time after. What it means is Israel was talking to Edom, country to country, peoples to peoples. And so it's extremely interesting. But when you're reading the prophets, just know that you might have interchanged regularly, sons of Jacob and tribes of Israel. Okay, so when Jacob died, of course, Joseph had sworn to him that he would bury him back in the promised land. And we find that this was not unusual for the Egyptians, and a neat little article on what happened in Genesis 50 is also in the NIV Archaeological Study Bible. The Ku-Sebek inscription discovered at Abydos in Egypt dates to the reign of Senwosret III during the Middle Kingdom period of Egyptian history. It contains a first-person account of the career of Ku-Sebek, who rose to power while in the pharaoh's service, apparently as a member of his bodyguard. Ku-Sebek boasts of his zealous service to Pharaoh, particularly highlighting his heroic bravery during a campaign in Canaan against the city of Shechem. The inscription justifies Ku-Sebek's cenotaph memorial monument at the Osiris shrine at Abydos, while also shedding light on two aspects of the biblical account of Joseph's career. First, someone whose outstanding service caught the Pharaoh's eye could be elevated to a high rank within the Egyptian government or military. And of course, that happened with Joseph. Joseph did it through interpreting dreams and having a great plan to handle the famine. And Pharaoh thought that was awesome and elevated him up to second in command to take care of all that. And then second, from this article, the most conclusive verification that an individual had earned the Pharaoh's favor was a distinguished burial or memorial erected in his honor. Fittingly, Genesis 50 describes the elaborate funeral of Joseph's father, Jacob, Israel, and mentions the embalming of Joseph. And so we find that what we read in Genesis 50 was not something that was impossible to take place in Egypt. In fact, it was something that we have secular records of. So let's look at Genesis 50, 1 to 14. Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for it, for that is how many are required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. And when the days of weeping for him were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, If now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, My father made me swear, saying, I am about to die. In my tomb that I hewed out for myself in the land of Canaan, there shall you bury me. Now therefore let me please go up and bury my father, then I will return. And Pharaoh answered, Go up and bury your father, as he made you swear. So Joseph went up to bury his father. With him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen. It was a very great company. When they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they lamented there with very great and grievous lamentation. And he made a mourning for his father 7 days. When the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning on the threshing floor of Atad, they said, This is a grievous mourning by the Egyptians. Therefore the place was named Abel Mitzrayim. It is beyond the Jordan. Thus his sons did for him as he had commanded them. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah to the east of Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. And of course, Joseph dies at the end of the book of Genesis, and then Exodus begins with a note that the current favor no longer remembered Joseph. It had been hundreds of years, and the Israelites at that point, the sons of Abraham, if you will, had grown to a point that Pharaoh was a little bit concerned about their great numbers and their power. And then, of course, we move right into them being able to leave through by the hand of Moses. So in the live class, I will at this point put the map and the timeline as you see back up on the screen and see if there are any questions, anything, any further clarification that I probably will not be able to give at that moment, but might be able to, and then we'll answer the next week. But I think something that we don't want to forget as we look at all these things from the Old Testament is that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, had no, there just was never a doubt. And for those of us who believe that the Bible is the Word of God, we don't doubt it either. But a lot of people in our world really doubt these things, which is very, very sad. But Jesus and the New Testament writers talked about Noah and Adam and the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And there's just that should be, if anyone was wondering, that should be enough. If you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and he believed in the reality of all this, then how can we question? Next week, we will be looking at Moses. And of course, Moses not only appeared to Jesus, but Peter, James, and John up there on the Mount of Transfiguration. Absolutely incredible. And so, not only noted historically, but seen in New Testament times. So, just incredible things, incredible support. Again, not that we need it. We believe the Bible's the Word of God. But for those who are questioning, incredible support throughout the New Testament and throughout history for these things and the reality of them. Next week, we will move into the book of Exodus. We'll look at the actual Exodus from Egypt. We will look at the conquest of the Promised Land and the time of the judges, really the time from the Exodus leading up to the time of the kingdom and the first king, Saul. May the Lord continue to bless us and keep us as we study his word.